Welcome to the Modern German Identity podcast. You are listening to Part 3, Immigration and Multiculturalism. Today's guest is Fatih Abay, a Turkish German and professor of European post-colonial migration at the Freie Universität Berlin.
Germany had never really been regarded as an immigrant country since its founding in 1871. German citizenship was always based on the idea that only ethnic Germans should be considered as citizens. This reigned true throughout the early 20th century and grew to become the primary platform for Hitler's Third Reich regime during World War II. But what about today? Germany is now seen as one of the most diverse countries within Europe and is a world leader in its refugee intake. This podcast will outline Germany's difficult struggle to change its perspectives on multiculturalism. It will show how certain policy changes pushed multiculturalism forward, while also explaining the fierce pushback designed to keep Germany from becoming an immigration country. Overall, despite some violence and anti-immigration media coverage in Germany, the country has pushed to redefine itself over the last 75 years, from being a completely ethnic one to a multicultural society. Although the topic of German immigration and multicultural identity is more convoluted than its division heritage and European identity, it will be seen that the path to multiculturalism within German society was not linear. Instead, waves of ultra-liberal policy, followed by ultra-right-wing radicalism, swayed public opinions in many ways over the last 75 years, and only gradually changed public perception over time. This narrative is important to understand the drastic shifts in German identities established after 1945. The discussion of post-war immigration history must start with two important factors that would shape Germany. First, its overly liberal asylum policy, and second, the influx of Turkish guest workers after World War II. To start, after the Allies took control of Germany and effectively ended the war, they did everything in their power to prevent Germany from becoming a hyper-ethnic and nationalist superpower once again. Parts of this process included leaving Germany divided and also pumping money into the West to help them rebuild structure and security through capitalism. However, there was also a third part where the German constitution in West Germany was rewritten, with much oversight from the Allies. In 1949, the German constitution included within it a clause pertaining to the allowing of asylum to anyone who sought it in Germany. The reason for including this in the constitution was primarily to create a Germany that no longer identified itself off of just its ethnicity. The problem was that Germany had never been a multicultural nation, and this overly liberal asylum policy would cause violence and protest against immigrants and refugees throughout the next 75 years. The next major foundation to German immigration took place in the 1950s during the economic miracle. This economic drive to rebuild Germany required an extensive labor force that Germany frankly just did not have after the war. Because of this, the West German government made deals with other countries, primarily Turkey, to allow guest workers, or Fremdarbeiter, to work to help to rebuild the country. Many of these Turks faced discrimination and resistance based off their appearances. They were never truly viewed as German because they were not ethnically German. This general expectation was that the foreigners would just come in, rebuild the German economy, and then return to their home countries. The Turkish guest workers did help contribute greatly to the economic boom of the 1950s and early 1960s within Germany due to the massive labor force. Throughout the 1950s, Germany established policies of non-integration, intending to ease workers back to their home countries. However, many guest workers would choose to begin settling down in the new country that they had helped to rebuild and start their families. This was the beginning of a major divide in what the people saw and what was actually happening. For years, Germans were told by the government that these workers would leave eventually, but more and more continued to settle down within the country with no expectations of leaving. These policies and the disconnect between the government rhetoric and actual situation created an immigrant problem ready to break down and explode with violence.
I want to start maybe here first with not only the Turkish guest workers, but in general the guest worker movement, because it's very important, and that's here also the case that Germany actually saw this kind of migration as an economic migration. So it clearly had the idea, okay, we need these workers. So that's why they were called Gastarbeiter, guest workers. And so they were calling for women and men, not only men here, from countries which basically can send people or where people could basically enlist. And basically those people were coming with the idea to work here. What the German government and German society completely ignored was the fact that, of course, these people from Turkey, from Italy, from former Yugoslavia, because they come from very rural and poor social backgrounds. For them, work at Germany mean basically a completely new existence and kind of also improvement of life standards. And of course, they decided then to stay. So this is actually what Germany never encountered with the whole economic agreements, also with the Vietnamese population in East Germany. So, and what actually it changed or kind of impacted the German identity is basically the kind of slowly movement to multiculturalism, or slowly movement to a completely different ethnic identity, because you had suddenly, especially 60s, 70s, like waves of migrants coming to this country, and basically also who decided to stay, and also who decided to bring their parents or their partners, but also their children with them. So, and here I speak a bit of my own family history now, because my parents came both from Turkey, completely from different regions. So they met in Berlin, actually. And that's actually interesting because their parents basically started that migration. And my parents, of course, were kind of very young. They were like teenagers coming to this country. And where they also suddenly had to work in order to support their families, but also in order to build their lives, because it was basically kind of already transmitted to them, okay, we are staying. So, and this is something with the German, with what German government or the German society did not really encounter with. And of course, that's the start of the migration movement.
The 1970s is where this disconnect begins to show signs of breaking down. The 1970s brought about a recession within West Germany due to the oil crisis. This was the first economic downturn that the country had seen since the end of the war. It is also important to note that Turkish immigration through the guest worker program was not decreasing, as many Germans thought it would. Instead, the number of Turks within Germany remained consistent, and many Turkish families began having kids within the country. The rise in the levels of foreigners, along with the recession, caused many Germans to start to question why this was happening and what the future of Germany would look like for the first time. It is important to note that German citizenship at this time had previously been determined by what is called jus sanguinis, or citizenship by ethnicity. This meant that in order to become a German citizen, you had to have German blood. In fact, throughout the 50s and 60s, ethnic Germans living outside of Germany were granted citizenship over the Turkish migrants. This idea of ethnic citizenship contributed to the idea that Germany was not an immigration country, and that the guest workers would return home after they were no longer needed in the 1970s. Also, the economic crisis brought rise to some strong media propaganda against immigrants. Since unemployment was high, it was easy to blame immigrants for the loss of jobs available and push to send these people back to Turkey. Despite the negative groups targeting these guest workers in the 1970s, some progress was also made. The permanent residence permit was established in 1978 and strengthened the legal status of long-term residents. These permits still did not grant Turkish people German citizenship, but showed the first steps in a fight for that right. It also shows that despite the negative outlets in the 1970s, progress for immigrants still existed within Germany and continued to push forwards despite opposing viewpoints. In the 1980s, immigrants came in from Italy, Spain, and Greece, but it was seen as less of an issue due to their membership in the European Economic Community. Other Europeans, though not German, were not as easily distinguished or seen as foreigners as much as the Turks were. The CDU, or the Christian Democratic Union, the center-right party, in the 80s began to offer incentives for the Turks who left Germany. These policies supporting sending immigrants back home gained support, 39% in 1978 to 68% in 1982. Some Turks took these incentives to leave, but the overwhelming majority did not. The economic downturn and policies of the 1970s on immigration show the first signs of a populist resistance against some of the more liberalized immigration and asylum practices that had persisted from the 50s. This resentment would come to a boiling point with the trigger of a new German reunification movement during the 1990s. The 1990s, in the wake of German reunification, brought about a new push for anti-immigration. Newfound German nationalism towards a reunified Germany fueled radical right-wing extremist groups to commit violent acts against foreigners within the new Germany. Many of these attacks happened in the former East German territory. These attacks were the biggest and most violent xenophobic attacks since World War II, and represent the powerful backlash to the changing multicultural climate within Germany. In 1991, there was a violent attack on an asylum hostel in Saxony in the east. In 1992, riots broke out in both Rostock and Lichtenhagen. In Rostock, protesters burned down an asylum hostel full of Vietnamese refugees in protest of the liberal asylum policies that were created in 1949. The Berlin newspaper, which is a slightly less left-leaning newspaper, wrote this about the riots of the 1990s. It is no coincidence that the alleged terrorists of the NSU were radicalized at the same time as the events in Rostock and elsewhere. One can describe the years after reunification as a wild phase of new right-wing radicalism that largely escaped state control. Even German politicians, like the Chancellor Heinrich Kohl, the champion of reunification, helped to propagate the message of asylum reform. Although it is important to note that Kohl denounced the violent acts and protests, he stated that Germany was not an immigration country and continued to fight to send the majority of Turks back to Turkey and reform the liberal asylum policy. Mostly in response to the radicalism going on in the country against the liberal asylum policy, a new amendment to the German law was passed under Kohl in 1993, and it gave individual German states the ability to determine refugee quotas. This gave local governments more power and also more ability to restrict the flow of refugees as they saw fit. It is important to note that although radical extremism was present in the 1990s, it was not the only base that had German support. Throughout this time, several groups within Germany fought to uphold the rights of refugees and maintain the liberal asylum policy, as well as Germany's newfound role as a multicultural freedom state. However, the violent outbursts of the 1990s did pull back many of the liberal policies that were previously established and brought into question Germany's future as the European multicultural refugee state.
In East Germany, in Rostock, Lichtenhagen, the main event with the attack on a building complex where Vietnamese people were living. Yeah, so that young Germans growing up in post-war Germany, so these were also young people who committed racist attacks on immigrants or migrants because they live already here and partly were also born here. And this is here very important because it's 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 uh, it's a kind of, it was a significant increase of anti-racism or on racism, of racism in Germany. And Germany, of course, had a wake-up call, and where basically then actually Germany started to kind of then actually implement more integration programs, but also programs on anti-fascism or on racism, so that also again the Nazi party, which was still in function in the name of NPD, kind of also was under observation of the Verfassungsschutz, of the German intelligence service agency, and also other radical organizations were basically then under observations under that agency. So that here, in that sense, Germany had a clear wake-up call.
Despite the protest and asylum law change that occurred in the 1990s, progress benefiting immigrants did occur. By the mid-1990s, many of the political parties began to come around to reforming nationalization and citizenship policies. Many believed that the EU helped to alter the course of thinking within Germany, and when it came to what it meant to be a citizen, not just Germans living in Germany. With the expansion of the European Economic Community in the 1980s and the creation of the modern European Union structure in the 1990s, public perception regarding non-Germans in Germany began to shift more favorably after 1993. However, despite this change in perspective, it is important to note that European immigrants from the EU countries were often treated better by Germans because they looked and seemed less foreign. The largest and most lasting change that benefited immigrants occurred in the late 1990s. Jus sanguinis, which was the idea of German citizenship based on ethnicity, was changed. In 1999, that law was shifted to citizenship by jus solis, or birthright, which would ensure that newborns born in Germany, no matter where their parents came from, would receive German citizenship. Despite Helmut Kohl declaring Germany not an immigration country in the 1990s, Germany was finally declared an immigration country in 2005, foreshadowing a new hope in immigration reform within Germany. The 1990s were a roller coaster in terms of immigration and refugee policy. The first half of the decade began with violent outbursts and a limitation of asylum law. However, the major strides in citizenship law, shift in European immigration acceptance, and declaration of Germany as an immigration country showed that the country was still able to push forwards despite violent backlash.
Affects in that sense, there's always this notion of not be welcomed in this country, no matter what, where you're born here, what kind of education you received, and also the idea how you perceive yourself. I can talk in my kind of own perception is, I mean, I have both. I have Turkish and German citizenship. I grew up here. I speak even better German than Turkish, so I have a good Turkish, but still you can clearly hear my German accent when I speak with Turkish people. And they also notice, oh, you're where you from, when I'm like in Turkey visiting my family or making vacations there. And so there's this kind of language barrier on that side. So because there I'm clearly marked as German. But then you're here still, if people would ask me German, despite my citizenship, despite the fact that I grew up here, I would say, no, I'm from Berlin, but I'm not German. So I would say I'm from Berlin, I'm from Germany, but I would never consider myself as ethnic or as German. And that is something to do with the whole idea of welcoming nature and the welcoming society, that German society really, at certain parts of your life, even if you get a very good education and you were very well integrated into the society, that still there are always points where they basically make sure you're not German fully. And this is also applying to a lot of my friends who live here for 15 years, who are Italian, who are Spanish, who are American, who are Brits. And even if they speak the language and they really feel, or they have kids, still there's always this problematic, because there's always this idea that you immediately mark with your ethnic belonging. And this is also where German racism kind of comes into the game again, because it does not accept you fully as a German citizen.
In 2015, a crisis of refugees seeking asylum would change German politics even further under the direction of Chancellor Angela Merkel. The Syrian civil war, which started around 2015, had caused massive amounts of refugees to flee for Europe. Many of these refugees were able to make it to Turkey and then enter EU territory through Greece. They then began to travel the Balkan route, which was a path through Balkan states to Budapest, Hungary. In Budapest, many refugees waited for trains or buses to take them further north. The goals of many of these refugees was to get to Germany, which was rumored to be the best country for being granted asylum due to that liberal asylum policy. Many refugees got stuck in Budapest as the Austrian and German governments decided whether or not they should accept these refugees. The Dublin Regulation, sometimes referred to as Dublin III, was European Union law already established that determined which country would be responsible for examining an asylum application. Normally, the country where the asylum seeker first entered Europe would have the immediate effects. However, given the large number of refugees, Greece could not handle taking all of the refugees back, and this created a large European dilemma. After weeks of waiting in Budapest, some of the refugees decided that their best hope at making it to Germany was to begin walking to the Austrian border. Thousands of refugees joined the ranks in what would be known as the Marsch der Hoffnung, or March of Hope. These people walked along the Autobahn and began the 179-kilometer journey to the Austrian border. Merkel's decision was a difficult one. She knew that there were many refugees seeking German asylum, and some were already on their way to the border. Merkel wanted all of Europe to help the refugees instead of invoking Dublin, which would overwhelm Greece. There were too many refugees for Greece to deal with alone. She did not want Germany to take full responsibility either. That is why her decision took a little while. Merkel attempted to get other EU countries to agree to take in refugees as well. Although some countries did take refugees, Germany ended up taking the majority. In 2015, Merkel declared that Germany would accept over 1 million refugees from Syria. In her famous speech, she uttered the words, "Wir schaffen das," or "we will do it." This decision solidified Germany's new role as a global immigration and asylum country by being one of the few countries willing to take on this many refugees. In the wake of Nazism and ethnic radicalism, Merkel believed that her decision to be a country of international peace and acceptance was inevitable in understanding this new German identity. Merkel took a lot of backlash for accepting these refugees. This was a large moral and political test for Germany, and Merkel's decision to accept these refugees in the humanitarian crisis was a major step in the right direction.
I remember I met some Syrian refugees, and they would just be happy about Merkel, and they really idolized her and say, "Oh yeah, Merkel, she's so good." And I mean, although maybe they don't know the politics behind it, the German politics, but still that Merkel and Germany has, in that sense, a very good reputation.
Once the refugees were allowed in, though, there was another story at hand. Germany had always been divided on this changing idea of a multicultural society. Some people welcomed the refugees with open arms and created programs such as German language courses and job training to help integrate refugees into German life. Others resisted the refugees fiercely. The best representation of this is through a poll taken at the time of the crisis. It stated that 60% of Germans believed that the country should accept refugees, and 40% believed that it would hurt the country. This statistic shows how divided Germany was on the issue of multiculturalism, but still pushed forwards despite the backlash. Integration was not easy for many refugees who came from a very different culture and social background. Integration did not happen overnight, and it is a process that many of these refugees continue today. A lot of refugees actively tried to learn German, and the government provided helpful tools and programs to aid in that. One refugee said that learning the language required a lot of work, and not all of the refugees could devote enough time to learning it really well. This was one of the major challenges that these refugees faced. They knew that it was important to learn German, but many just did not have the time necessary to learn it right away because they needed to provide for themselves. Racist language also surrounded the refugees, focusing on how they were not German and could not truly adapt to the culture. One refugee said that sometimes people on the bus would hold their bags or tuck them underneath the seats to get away from them. Sometimes they would also block them from sitting next to them on the bus. This is an example of some systemic racism within the German society towards non-European immigrants. Some Germans believed that some of the refugees that came into the country were criminals and they did not trust them. One refugee said, "My friend and I were buying clothes. We paid for them and tried to leave, but someone in the store thought that the clothes were being stolen and called the police." Refugees were seen as being potential criminals and non-German because of the clear difference in race. A lot of this rhetoric was spread around by radical right-wing media and politicians who preyed on fear of a changing German nation. Aside from people who resisted refugee integration, there were a lot of programs offered by the government and German people to help integrate the refugees into the community. Integration courses about Alltagsleben and language are offered for refugees in some German communities. 800,000 people a year take integration courses in Germany that teach language and how to navigate daily life. These students are refugees, immigrants, and EU members from other countries that have settled in Germany. There are also educational and vocational labor training programs offered in areas like Niedersachsen. These give refugees concrete skills for labor market integration. One refugee explained in an interview how he got a job through one of these programs and loves it because it helps him to have friends, work on his language, and have things to do. The state invests in the refugees with these integration and job training programs, therefore showing an upstanding commitment from the German government towards integration and multiculturalism. All in all, when it comes to modern integration, there are not a lot of clear rules. Discrimination does exist within the population, but there are also a lot of people willing to help and programs that have been set in place by the state to help with integration, job placement, and adaptation.
There were really a lot of successful histories and stories of the community until today. So you have really successful entrepreneurs who are part of the Turkish Muslim community or Turkish community, doctors, nurses, professors. I mean, of course, they're like successful stories, but still, it's always, I grew up with this, that you were never welcome. This is before, and and of course, my parents, of course, they witnessed more racism just by doing their colleagues, maybe at work. I experienced it not much in the way how I grew up because I attended a clearly more white German school. But there were, of course, these nuances that you were compared to the other Turkish community. Oh, the others are not good, you are better, or you're not like, or Turks are bad. So there's, of course, this kind of racism I still see. Also on the job market, clearly because of your name. But also when it comes to look for an apartment, even if you're well-dressed, well-educated, you have your resume, you have your education, but that they even also here, and not only for Turks, I mean for a lot of people who have no German names, Uh, Also, I mean, I have clearly American friends as well, or UK, friends from UK who are struggling to find an apartment here because the German landlords do not want to rent to foreigners their apartments. So this is actually what's happening.
Directly following the Syrian refugee crisis and emergence of integration programs came the 2017 elections in Germany. This election year provided an idea that despite progress, radical right-wing ideas were still present within the German population. In 2017, Angela Merkel was able to hold on to her role as chancellor, but only by a narrow margin. In fact, many voters that had previously voted for her CDU party, or center-right party, were unhappy with her coalition with the SPD, or center-left party, and her handling of the Syrian refugee crisis. This prompted some voters to differentiate from the CDU in favor of the new alt-right party, Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD. The AfD party had never won seats in the Bundestag for their entire career as a party. In 2017, the AfD won 94 seats in the Bundestag, making it the third largest party by seat number. This massive transformation in German politics favoring the alt-right was brought on primarily because of conservative Germans unhappy with the compromises that Merkel was making when it came to immigration and integration. So what does this mean? Does the resurgence of a radical right undermine the progress that has been made over the last 75 years? It is a complex question, but political policy and support tends to move in waves. Whenever something radical happens in one direction, like with the refugee crisis, people are bound to resist it and push back a little bit. What is important is continuing to move forward in the wake of resistance in order to help reshape and redefine the country in ways supported by the majority of Germans.
The problem is with the AfD is the AfD is actually, of course, clearly a right-wing populist party, and of course, clearly using racist language. So this, I think, we should really redefine that it's a very racist party. Yeah. The problem is here that there is a big part of German society, for sure, who is kind of agreeing with this, but not in that kind of language what they used to. And this is because how the AfD is representing itself, it's clearly reminding a lot to the pictures and to the beginnings of the Hitler Nazi regime. So, and because of this, because here, Germans' memory policy comes here again back into the picture, because they know what this kind of refers to. That's why a lot of the majority of the German society, of course, doesn't agree with the AfD in that sense. So you have clearly politicians and also people who are supporting other, or even also CDU, who is the Christian Democratic Union, who's really kind of, or the FDP, who has really kind of really touching points with the anti-migration laws or positions of the AfD, right? But when it then comes to the use of rhetoric and language and the xenophobia, then they are really, really kind of differing there. So this is here very important in that sense that the AfD is kind of, again, like what back to the 90s when we had this kind of wake-up call in the racist attacks, but now we have the AfD as a wake-up call in German politics, in German parliaments. I mean, they are part of regional parliaments. They are the biggest in East Germany, which is completely scary. So, and this is, I think, now a wake-up call. We will see next year what the elections will bring.
It is unknown what is in store for the future of Germany as an immigration country. The last 75 years have painted a cloudy picture of waves of progress followed by periods of backlash and violence. However, despite these instances of groups of Germans resisting change, the most important thing to highlight is the changes that have stuck. Germany has gone through a major identity change when it comes to immigration. Once a country of ethnic superiority rhetoric, has become arguably the most liberal and accepting European nation when it comes to foreigners. Germany also still has one of the most liberal asylum policies of any nation, and has accepted more refugees than almost any other Western country. I am of the belief that a lot of these radical liberal policy changes have come from Germany trying to cope with its past. By pushing forth these pro-immigration policies and multiculturalist ideas, the government has made progress slowly and changed the idea of what it means to be a German. This was seen through the change in German citizenship law. And while Germany still faces many challenges, I believe that it will continue to progress in this area and redefine itself and the country as an area of hope and freedom within Europe.